He didn't even let her put down her bag. Nathaniel Crowe looked at Eliza Hart the way a man looks at a horse he has already decided not to buy a single slow glance, top to bottom and then away, as if she were not worth the effort of a second look. She had traveled 19 days to get to that train platform. 19 days on coaches and rail cars, sleeping upright, eating whatever she could afford, holding the address in her coat pocket like it was something precious. And he looked at her for maybe 4 seconds before he turned to his cousin and said, loud enough for everyone standing nearby to hear, "She's playing, Caleb. I won't do it. I don't care what her letters said." Eliza stood there with her trunk at her feet and her heart somewhere below the platform boards. If you had been standing where she was 19 days from home, no money to go back, no one waiting for you, if you did, what would you have done? This is the story of a woman who was rejected before she was even given a chance. And what happened next changed everything. If stories like this one reach you somewhere deep, if you have ever been told you were not enough, subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza's journey all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment below telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, which Eliza Hart always remembered later, as the day everything in her life cracked open and rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. She had been sitting at the narrow desk in the back room of the Holloway School for Young Ladies when Mrs. Fenwick pushed the door open without knocking and held the yellow envelope out at arm's length as if it might bite. Mrs. Fenwick didn't approve of telegrams. She said they carried nothing but bad news or worse decisions. She was, in Eliza's case, half right. Eliza opened it carefully, the way she did most things methodically, without rushing, already preparing herself for disappointment. The message was brief. Most of the important ones were: arrangements confirmed, stop, travel to Denison Creek, stop, Nathaniel Crowe, stop. That was all. No warmth, no anticipation, not even a complete sentence that pretended to be polite. But Eliza had read enough about frontier correspondence to know that men out west didn't waste words, and she told herself that brevity wasn't the same as coldness. She told herself that a lot of things weren't what they looked like. She was 26 years old, which in Philadelphia in 1875 already put her past the age when most women in her circle had married and settled. She had outlasted 2 engagements, one ended by a family's financial ruin, one ended by a man who simply stopped appearing at the door without explanation, and she had spent the years since teaching reading comprehension to the daughters of merchants and minor politicians, sleeping in a drafty room at the back of the school, eating meals that were adequate without ever being satisfying. It was a life, it functioned, but it had the quality of a song played in the wrong key, technically correct and deeply unsatisfying. The arrangement with Nathaniel Crowe had come through her cousin Margaret, who had a wide network of acquaintances and a genuine belief that Eliza's problem was simply one of geography. The right man existed somewhere, Margaret insisted. He just wasn't in Philadelphia. When a mutual connection mentioned that a bachelor banker in the Colorado territories was looking for an educated wife, someone who could hold conversation, manage correspondence, and present well at social functions, Margaret had volunteered Eliza's name before Eliza had finished her first cup of tea. "You're educated," Margaret had said, ticking off attributes on her fingers. "You're composed. You run a household. You have good posture, and your teeth are fine. What more does a practical man need?" What Eliza had felt in that moment was a combination of gratitude and faint humiliation that she had gotten quite skilled at feeling simultaneously. She thanked Margaret, agreed to exchange letters with Mr. Crowe, and then went home and looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin for a long time. She had brown hair that did what she asked of it on good days and resisted her entirely on others. Her face was, she had heard the word before, sensible. Strong jaw, eyes that were dark and attentive rather than soft and pretty. She was not the woman who turned heads at social gatherings. She was the woman people said was striking when you got to know her, which was a kind way of saying she required patience. Nathaniel Crowe's letters were formal and businesslike, which she had appreciated. He described Denison Creek, his banking operation, his position in the community. He mentioned that he kept a large house and that he expected his wife to manage it competently. He said he valued intelligence and reliability over sentiment. He asked about her education, her family background, and whether she was accustomed to hard work. He did not ask what she looked like. She assumed that meant he was not the kind of man who prioritized surface appearances. She had been wrong. She would later think about how thoroughly, systematically wrong she had been. The journey west took 19 days and used nearly all of the money she had saved over 3 years of careful, deliberate economy. She brought 2 good dresses, her books, her mother's silverware wrapped in muslin at the bottom of her trunk, and a small photograph of the only 2 people who had ever made her feel entirely at ease, her parents, Both gone now, her father to fever, her mother to a grief that outlasted the fever by only 14 months. She had no one in Philadelphia who would miss her with any urgency. That had been part of what made the arrangement feel not just possible, but right. Denison Creek was larger than she expected. The main street had a Bank Crow and Associates. The sign read in neat painted letters a general store, a livery stable, a hotel, a barber shop, and a scattering of other establishments that indicated a town in the process of deciding whether it would thrive or simply persist. The platform where the stagecoach stopped was unpaved and dusty, and the air had a quality she had never encountered before, thin and sharp and somehow larger than air had any right to be. Like breathing was a bigger act out here than it had been anywhere else. There were 3 men waiting near the platform. She recognized Nathaniel Crow from the small photograph he had included with his third letter, a formal daguerreotype of a man in a good suit with the kind of face that was handsome in a deliberate, maintained way. Beside him stood a man who was physically his opposite in nearly every respect. Where Nathaniel was tailored, this second man wore a canvas coat that had seen serious weather. Where Nathaniel stood with the composed stillness of someone accustomed to being watched, this man stood the way people stand when they're thinking about something else. Weight shifted, one thumb hooked in his belt, eyes moving across the street like he was tracking something. She would learn his name was Caleb Mercer, Nathaniel's cousin. She would learn a great many things about Caleb Mercer over the months that followed. But in that first moment, she registered him only as a presence large, unhurried, and slightly apart from the others, like he had come because someone asked him to, rather than because he wanted to be there. Nathaniel stepped forward when she descended from the coach. He looked at her. That was the thing she kept returning to afterward. The look itself lasted no longer than 4 or 5 seconds. But she had been looked at by men all her life, and she understood the grammar of it. There was the look that found something, the look that was politely neutral, and the look that found nothing. Nathaniel Crow's look was the third kind. She watched it happen in real time, the slight flattening of his expression, the way his chin dropped just a fraction, the small involuntary adjustment of his posture that said he was recalibrating something he had already planned. He turned to the man beside him, not to her, to his cousin. "She's playing, Caleb," he said, not quietly. "I won't do it. I don't care what her letter said." There it was. Eliza stood very still. She had the odd, dissociated sensation of hearing something terrible from a slight distance, as if the sound had to travel further than it should have. She heard the words. She understood the words. Her mind processed them with its usual efficiency, which at that moment she would have given anything to shut off. Plain, won't do it, don't care. The third man, the one she hadn't noticed yet, who was standing further back near a post, actually flinched. She saw it from the corner of her eye. Caleb Mercer did not flinch. He went very still instead, which turned out to be more alarming. "Nathaniel?" he said. His voice was low and even the kind that doesn't rise because it doesn't need to. "I'm not being unkind," Nathaniel said, already half turning away. "I'm being practical. The arrangement was based on mutual benefit. I had expectations. She doesn't meet them. She is standing right there. I'm aware of where she's standing." Eliza set her trunk down. She did it carefully with both hands because she needed something to do with her body while her mind worked through what was happening. She was of several other people on the platform, a woman with a basket, a boy leading a horse, 2 men by the station door who had stopped what they were doing to watch. The particular awfulness of being humiliated in public was the way it turned you into a spectacle. She had nowhere to look that wasn't a witness, Mr. Crow, she said. Nathaniel looked at her with the expression of a man who has been interrupted by something he had already mentally filed away. "I don't require your explanation," she continued. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I understood this was an arrangement based on mutual assessment. You've made your assessment. I would appreciate the courtesy of a direct conversation, however, rather than being discussed as though I've already left." Something moved across Nathaniel's face. She couldn't be certain if it was shame or simply irritation at having been addressed directly. He said nothing for a moment. "The arrangement is dissolved," he said finally. "I'll have someone see to your accommodation tonight. You can arrange return passage in the morning." He walked away. He actually walked away, back toward the bank as if the matter were a ledger entry he had closed. Eliza stood there with her trunk and her 2 dresses and her mother's silverware at her feet and the thin Colorado air in her lungs and approximately $4 left to her name. Return passage cost $12. She had calculated that before she left Philadelphia. In the careful, methodical way she calculated everything. She had even made a small note of it in her journal, thinking it was the kind of thing you documented as preparation, not as a possibility you would actually need. The platform had gone quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something uncomfortable has happened, and no one knows whether to speak or retreat. Caleb Mercer walked over. He didn't approach her the way men usually approached women in difficult situations, with that particular mixture of pity and self-consciousness that made you feel worse for having required their assistance. He walked over the way he'd walked across the rest of the platform, at his own pace, not performing anything. "Miss Hart," he said. She looked at him directly. She had learned years ago that looking away first in difficult moments was a surrender she couldn't afford. He had gray-green eyes, she noticed, set in a face that the frontier had worked on, considerably deeply lined around the eyes, weathered at the jaw, the kind of face that looked older than it was until you caught the eyes themselves, which were sharp and completely present. "I'm sorry about what just happened," he said. "There's no excuse for it." "Thank you," she said, because what else was there? She kept her voice level. "Do you have arrangements for tonight?" "Your cousin indicated someone would see to accommodation. I'll make sure that actually happens." He said it simply, without qualification. "And I'd like to speak with you if you're willing." "Not right this moment, when you've had time to settle." She studied him. She was good at reading people. It was one of the skills her life had required of her, the ability to distinguish between genuine intention and performed courtesy. What she saw in Caleb Mercer was neither pity nor the complicated discomfort of a man cleaning up someone else's mess. He looked, if she was reading it correctly, genuinely angry, not at her. The anger was directed somewhere else entirely, and he was working to keep it contained. "All right," she said. He nodded and went to speak with the station manager. She watched him for a moment, then looked back at the street where Nathaniel Crowe had disappeared, and then she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do. She pressed her lips together hard and breathed through her nose until the burn behind her eyes subsided. She was not going to cry on a train platform in Denison Creek, Colorado. She was not. She had done far harder things than this. She had done harder things than this. She repeated it until it felt like something she believed. The hotel was small and clean, which was more than she had expected. The room had a window that looked out over the back alley, which was less than she had hoped, but she had slept in worse places on the journey west, and she was past caring about views. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, and her hands folded in her lap, and she let herself think through the situation with the clear-eyed practicality that had gotten her through the 2 previous failed engagements and the death of both her parents and 3 years of teaching other people's daughters about books. She wished she had more time to read herself. Facts. She was better with facts than feelings. Fact, she had $4. Return passage cost $12. She was approximately $8 short of being able to leave. Fact, she knew no one in Denison Creek. She had no family closer than Margaret in Philadelphia, who had 3 children and a husband and no extra room, and who Eliza suspected would be deeply embarrassed by this outcome, even though she would never say so directly. Fact, she had skills. She could read and write well enough to teach others to do it. She could keep household accounts. She had managed a school's supply correspondence for 2 years. She could cook adequate meals under difficult circumstances, and sew with enough competence to be functional, if not elegant. Fact, none of those facts helped her tonight. She was still sitting with her coat on when the knock came at the door. She opened it expecting a hotel employee with towels or a message about dinner, and found instead Caleb Mercer, hat in hand, standing in the hallway with the particular posture of a man who has thought carefully about whether to come and has decided the answer is yes, despite reasonable arguments against it. "I don't want to intrude," he said. "I wanted to make sure you'd eaten." She hadn't. She had forgotten entirely. "I was about to," she said, which was not true. "There's a decent enough place 2 blocks down. If you'd be willing," he added quickly. "I have something I want to talk to you about. A proposal." Not, he paused, and something crossed his face that might have been the frontier equivalent of awkwardness. "Not that kind, a different kind of proposal. But I'd rather put some food on the table first, if that suits you." She considered him. She was 26 years old, alone in a Colorado town with $4, and a man she had known for approximately 2 hours wanted to make her a proposal of some kind over a decent meal. She got her coat. The restaurant, it was really more of a dining room attached to a boarding house, was warm and smelled of roasted meat and coffee, and Eliza realized as she sat down that she was hungry in the bone-deep way that comes from days of inadequate meals and acute stress. She ordered carefully, out of habit, keeping to the less expensive items, and then caught herself doing it and felt the small, familiar humiliation of that particular economy. Caleb ordered enough food for both of them without making a point of it and talked about nothing important while they waited the town, the season, the particular difficulty of Colorado winters versus what she was probably used to in Pennsylvania. She answered his questions honestly and asked some of her own. He ran a cattle ranch 15 miles outside of town. He had built it himself over 9 years, starting with 20 head of cattle and a leaking barn, and expanding by increments that he described in a matter-of-fact way that made it clear he was not boasting, simply accounting for time. How do you know, Nathaniel? She asked, because she needed to understand the geography of what had happened to her. His father and my mother were siblings, Caleb said. We grew up in the same county in Kansas. I came west first. Nathaniel followed when the banking opportunity opened up. He paused. We're not close. We never have been, particularly. He asked me to be there today because he stopped, looked down at his coffee. I'm not entirely sure why he asked me. I think he wanted a witness. He likes having witnesses. For business transactions, Eliza said. He thinks most things are business transactions. She absorbed that. The food arrived and they ate, and the warmth of the room and the actual meal were doing something to the hard knot of shock and anger she had been carrying since the platform. Not dissolving it, but making it more manageable. The proposal, she said, when the plates were mostly clear. Caleb wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He had large hands. She noticed scarred across the knuckles with a long-heeled cut along the right thumb that spoke to work done with sharp implements over many years. They were the hands of someone who built things rather than managed them. I need a housekeeper, he said, in the honest sense. Someone to manage the domestic side of the ranch operation, the food, the supplies, the accounts for that part of things. I have 6 hands who eat like horses, and I've been managing it myself, which means I'm not managing it well. The house is, he looked briefly pained. The house needs attention. She waited. This wasn't the whole of it. I'm also, he continued more slowly, aware of how it looks for a woman to be alone in a town like this, without connections or funds. I know what the options are, and they're not good. He said this without any softness that felt false. It was the same directness he had used on the platform, the same quality she had noticed then. So here's what I'm suggesting, Miss Hart. You come to the ranch. You manage the household. You're compensated fairly. And he stopped again, then looked at her directly. And I'll tell people you're my wife. Eliza set down her cup very precisely. Your wife, she said, in name, not in any other sense. You'd have your own room, your own space. The hands will respect you if I ask them to, and I'll ask them to. It would give you standing in the community that being an unattached woman without family connection wouldn't, and he paused. And it would give Nathaniel exactly the kind of outcome that I think would bother him considerably. There it was. She almost laughed. The honesty of it, the acknowledgement that there was something personal in his motivation beyond simple charity, made her trust it more than if he had presented it as purely altruistic. For how long? She asked. 6 months. It's at the end of 6 months, if you want to leave, I'll provide full passage and a letter of reference that will get you any position you choose. If you want to stay, he said it carefully, not performing anything. We reassess. You're offering me an arrangement, she said. The same thing your cousin offered. Except yours has conditions that actually account for the fact that I'm a person. He didn't look away from that, yes. And you want nothing in return. I want the house managed and the accounts kept. That's not nothing. She looked at him for a long time. She was doing the same calculation she had done upstairs in her room, but the variables had shifted. She was still $8 short. She still had no one waiting in Philadelphia. She still had 2 dresses and her mother's silverware and the particular stubborn pride that had kept her standing upright on that platform when every instinct she had told her to sit down on her trunk and put her face in her hands. But now there was a different variable on the other side of the equation. A man who had seen what his cousin did and had not walked away. Who had come to a hotel room an hour later not with pity, but with something that looked more like a plan. She was good at reading people. She was, in fact, excellent at it. All right, Mr. Mercer, she said, 6 months. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, though he covered it quickly. Caleb, he said, if we're going to tell people you're my wife, you should probably call me Caleb. All right, Caleb. She picked up her coffee. Tell me about the house, he told her. It took a while. The house, from his description, was 4 walls, a roof that worked when it wasn't snowing, and a stove that required specific handling or it drew wrong and filled the kitchen with smoke. The supply situation was best described as reactive. The books were not kept in any formal sense. 2 of the 6 ranch hands could not read, which complicated basic operations. The nearest town with a doctor was Denison Creek, 15 miles, which was fine in summer and not fine in winter. She listened to all of it. She was already reorganizing things in her mind supply schedules, account formats, ways to manage a stove that had a difficult temperament. It was the part of her that functioned best, the part that saw a problem and started building a solution before she had consciously decided to. One question, she said when he had finished. Go ahead, Nathaniel. When he sees us, when he finds out, how do you expect him to react? Caleb set down his cup. Badly, he said, and there was something in the single word that was both honest and, she thought, slightly satisfied. Good, Eliza said. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived in Denison Creek, something about the situation felt almost right. Not fixed, not resolved, but pointed in a direction she could work with. She went back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed again, but this time she took off her coat. She opened her trunk and took out her journal and wrote down everything she knew about the ranch, the supplies, the accounts, the stove, the 6 hands who ate like horses. She made a list of questions she had not thought to ask, and a list of problems she could already see solutions to. She was not a woman who had been rejected. She was a woman with a new position, and a complicated arrangement, and 6 months to figure out what exactly she was made of. She wrote for 2 hours and went to sleep, and did not cry once, which she counted, without drama, as a victory. In the morning, when Caleb Mercer's wagon appeared in front of the hotel at 7, she was already standing outside with her trunk packed and her coat buttoned and her dark, attentive eyes taking in the road west with the same steady focus she brought to everything. She climbed up onto the wagon seat before he could offer assistance, because she had a feeling she was going to need to establish early that she didn't require assistance with things she could do herself. He glanced at her. She looked back at the road. "Ready?" he said. "I've been ready for 19 days, she said. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon rolled west, away from the town, away from the platform, away from the 4 seconds that had cracked everything open and rearranged it into something none of them could have predicted. 15 miles out, the ranch appeared at the end of a dirt track bordered by scrub and dry grass, and it was exactly as bad as he had described: a large, angular house that looked like it had been built in stages by a man with good intentions and inconsistent time, surrounded by outbuildings in various conditions, with a barn that was the best maintained structure on the property by a significant margin. A dog came running from the barn, large, pale-coated, all head and chest, and planted itself in front of the wagon without barking, just watching. "That's Scout," Caleb said. "He'll be all right once he knows you." Eliza climbed down from the wagon seat and looked at Scout for a moment, and Scout looked back at her with the specific evaluative attention of an animal that takes its job seriously. Then she crouched down to his level, which she could see surprised Caleb slightly from the corner of her eye, and she let Scout do his evaluation without interference. After a moment, the dog put his nose against her palm. "There," she said quietly. She stood up, brushed her skirt, and looked at the house. "Show me the stove first," she said. "If I understand the stove, I can work with the rest." Caleb Mercer looked at her with those gray-green eyes that were sharp and completely present, and she thought she saw something shift in them, not admiration exactly, but a revision of some kind, an adjustment of a mental calculation. He showed her the stove. She had it figured out in 20 minutes. And that, in the way that small things sometimes carry the weight of much larger ones, was how it began. The stove, it turned out, was only the beginning. Eliza spent the first 3 days at the Mercer Ranch doing what she always did. When she entered an unfamiliar situation, she watched, she listened, and she did not form conclusions until she had enough information to form accurate ones. She had learned this the hard way, over years of managing other people's households and other people's children, and the particular politics of institutions run by people who believed authority was the same thing as competence. It rarely was. The house was worse than Caleb had described, which she thought showed a certain optimism on his part, or possibly an inability to see domestic disorder the way a person trained to see it could. The supply pantry had been stocked without any organizing principle. She could identify dried beans next to axle grease, flour sacks open and drawing moisture, coffee measured out in amounts that suggested whoever was doing it was guessing. The account ledger, when she found it on the 3rd morning, wedged behind a stack of catalogs in the sitting room, was 3 years of figures written in 4 different hands with no consistent method, and at least 2 gaps of several months where nothing had been recorded at all. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the stove that needed attention before it became a hole. One window in the back bedroom had a crack in it sealed with newspaper that was already brown and crumbling. She made a list. Her lists were dense and specific, and written in the small, precise hand she had developed over years of fitting observations into narrow margins. Caleb found her at the kitchen table on the 4th morning with the list in front of her and his account ledger open beside it, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table and then at her. "That bad," he said. "The accounts are recoverable," she said. "The pantry organization is a matter of a day's work. The floor near the stove is a structural issue, and will need someone who knows timber work." He came further into the kitchen and poured himself coffee from the pot she had already made. She was up an hour before the hands every morning, which she had decided without being asked, because it was simply the most logical approach. He sat down across from her and looked at the ledger. "I know the accounts are a mess," he said. "I kept meaning to." "You had a ranch to run," she said, not unkindly. "I understand the prioritization." She turned the ledger so he could see the page she'd been working from. "I've reconstructed the last 18 months from the receipts I found in the tin box on the shelf. You've been operating at a modest profit, but you've been overpaying for feed because you're not buying in quantity. If we calculate projected winter needs now and place a consolidated order before October, I estimate you save between 12 and 15%. Caleb looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. You did this since last night, he said. I don't sleep particularly well in new places, she said. He looked up at her. The morning light was coming through the east window, and she was aware, in a detached way, that she probably looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been awake too long working through someone else's numbers. Her hair was not arranged correctly. There was ink on her second finger. She did not particularly care. 12 to 15%, he said, conservatively. He set down his coffee. Something was working behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read, yet she was still learning him, still cataloging the small differences between his thoughtful silences and his uncomfortable ones. This one felt like neither. All right, he said. What do you need from me to do this properly? A full accounting of current stock, projected head count through winter, and the name of the feed supplier you've been using. Haskell's out of Millard Junction. Is there another supplier within reasonable distance? Torrance Brothers further south. More expensive per unit, but they sell in bulk at discount. He paused. How did you know that? Because that's how bulk suppliers operate. She picked up her pen. I'll write both of them. You'll need to sign the letter as it comes from the ranch, but I can draft it. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Eliza. She looked up. I told the hands you're my wife, he said. They took it, some of them better than others. Pete and Morris accepted it straight away. Dunmore's going to be difficult. She set the pen down. Which one is Dunmore? Red beard. Talks too much. He was here before the others. Caleb said it in a tone that suggested complicated history. He has opinions about women on working ranches. I see. I'm not telling you to manage him differently than the others. I'm telling you so you're not surprised. She appreciated that. She picked the pen back up. I won't be surprised, she said. I've managed men like Dunmore before. At a school for young ladies? You'd be surprised how much crossover there is, she said. He laughed. It was a short sound, catching him slightly off guard by its own existence, and he looked briefly like a different man, younger, or at least less guarded. She noted it and went back to her letters. She met Dunmore properly that same afternoon, in the way that turned out to matter. She had gone out to the supply barn to measure the current feed stores herself, rather than work from anyone else's estimate, and she was in the middle of recording figures in her notebook when she heard boots behind her, and turned to find a man of about 40, with an unkempt red beard, watching her from the barn door with the particular expression of someone who has decided not to like something before getting enough information to make that decision intelligently. You're the wife, he said. I am, she said, and turned back to her measurement. And you're Dunmore, Caleb mentioned you. A pause. She could hear him recalibrating slightly, not expecting to have been discussed. Figured you'd stay in the house, he said. I needed the feed inventory. She wrote down the number. Do you know how long this grain has been stored here? Since August. Why? Because improperly stored grain can develop mold, which affects the cattle. This supply looks fine, but I want to establish a rotation system going forward. She turned to look at him directly. I'm going to be doing things like this. Measuring things. Asking questions, recording answers. It's not about interfering with how the ranch runs. It's about making sure the household side doesn't create problems for the ranch side. Does that make sense? He looked at her. He was doing the same thing people always did with her, looking for something to dismiss and not finding exactly what he expected to find. You know about grain storage, he said. Not a question. Closer to doubt wearing questions clothing. I know about supply management. Some of it overlaps. She closed her notebook. If you have better information than I do about any of this, I'd genuinely like to hear it. You've been here longer than anyone. Another pause. Longer this time. The bin on the left gets damp after hard rain, he said. Has to do with how it was built. Caleb knows, but keeps forgetting to fix it. Which means anything stored there needs to come out first and go fast. She wrote that down. She felt him watching her write it down. Thank you, she said. That's useful. He didn't say anything else, but when she left the barn, he held the door. She didn't make anything of it. The community of Denison Creek came at her gradually, in the way that frontier towns tended to, not all at once, but in individual approaches, each person bringing their own particular version of opinion. The women came first, which she had expected. Women in small towns ran the social temperature, and she was a new variable. The first was Ruth Alderman, wife of the hardware proprietor, who came to the ranch on the second Saturday with a jar of preserved plums and the specific smile of a woman conducting an assessment. Eliza served her coffee, and the conversation went through the predictable geography. Where was she from? How had she and Caleb met? Did she find it very different from back east? How was she managing the house? Eliza answered everything clearly and without elaboration. and asked Ruth questions in return about the town's supply schedule and whether there was a regular market day. Ruth had not expected to be asked questions. She answered them, though, because it turned out she had strong opinions about market day and the fact that the current arrangement was inefficient. And by the time she left an hour later, she had told Eliza more about the town's domestic economy than she had probably intended. That was deliberate, Caleb said after Ruth's wagon had gone. He was leaning against the porch post. She knows everyone and how they operate, Eliza said. That's valuable. You could have just been friendly. I was friendly. I was also listening. She looked at him. They're not mutually exclusive. He shook his head slowly, and there was something in it that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. The harder community encounter came 2 weeks later, in town when she went to the general store for the supply run she had organized. She went alone because Caleb had fencing work that couldn't wait, and she drove the wagon herself, which she had practiced sufficiently in the 2 weeks at the ranch to be competent, if not graceful. The store owner, a man named Pitts, was straightforward enough. The difficulty was the group of women near the bolt goods who she could hear clearly, because they made no particular effort not to be heard. That's Mercer's wife, one of them said. The one from back east. She came out for Nathaniel Crow, another voice said. He didn't want her. And Caleb took her off his hands. She kept her list in front of her and her handwriting steady and gave Pitts the order exactly as she had written it. She did not look toward the bolt goods section. She was aware that her face was doing the careful thing it did when she was managing something, and she concentrated on keeping it from tightening at the jaw. You'll need the bulk price on the flour, she told Pitts. I have 3 months projected consumption here if you need to verify the quantity makes sense. Pitts looked at the paper she handed him. He was a practical man. She could see the kind who respected preparation the way he respected a square joint or a level shelf. Who did these figures, he said. I did. He looked up at her. You always buy this way? I try to. He nodded slowly. I can do the bulk price on the flour and the salt. The molasses I'll have to order special at that quantity. Can you have it by the end of the month? Probably. I'll check back in 10 days. She took her goods, loaded the wagon. 2 men near the door moved to help without being asked, which she allowed without comment, and drove back to the ranch. She did not tell Caleb about what she had overheard at the bolt goods section, because it was not information that required his response, and she was not in the habit of requiring people to react to her difficulties on her behalf. But she thought about it that night, sitting at the kitchen table with the supply accounts in front of her, Scout's large head resting on her foot, with a weight she had already come to find oddly comforting. She thought about what she had heard, and she thought about the platform, and Nathaniel's 4-second evaluation, and the phrase that had followed her all the way from Philadelphia, and apparently arrived in Denison Creek before she did. She's plain. I won't do it. She was not going to let that sentence have more power over her than it deserved. She had to sit as this. But deciding something and achieving it were different projects, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that the gap between them required daily maintenance. What she was better at, she had discovered, was doing things. The doing was easier than the thinking. So she did things. She reorganized the pantry, which took 1 day and produced visible results. Hob, the youngest of the hands, came in for his midday meal on the 2nd day and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stared at the shelves with an expression of total confusion. Did someone? He started. I moved things, she said. Everything's labeled. The system is by category, then by frequency of use. He looked at her. He was maybe 19, with the raw, uncertain quality of someone who had not yet grown fully into his own face. It always used to take me 10 minutes to find the coffees, he said. It's on the 2nd shelf, left side, next to the sugar. He found it in 4 seconds. He stood there holding the coffee tin with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and mild bewilderment. And then he said, "Thank you, ma'am," very sincerely, and she decided Hob was going to be all right. She learned to ride, which had not been in any plan she made but became necessary when she understood that 15 miles of isolation meant 15 miles of dependency, unless she could move independently. She asked Caleb directly. She had already established the habit of directness with him, because she found it was the only mode of communication he responded to without introducing unnecessary friction. He found her a horse with a manageable temperament, a bay mare named Cora, who had enough years on her to have developed patience with human inconsistency, and he gave Eliza the basic instruction himself, which turned out to require more patience from both of them than either had expected. She was not a natural rider. She had no instinct for it, and she knew she had no instinct for it. And she said so plainly, which seemed to take Caleb slightly off guard, not the admission, but the directness of it. Most people pretend they're picking it up faster than they are, he said. That seems counterproductive when the goal is to actually ride, she said. He looked at her from where he was standing at Cora's head. It is counterproductive, he agreed. Okay, let's try again from the beginning. She fell off once. She hit the ground hard enough to jar every thought out of her head for a full second, and lay there in the dirt of the corral staring up at the pale November sky. And she heard Caleb's boots in the dirt moving toward her, and she held up one hand before he could reach her. "Give me a moment," she said. I'm assessing." She did a rapid inventory. Nothing broken. Hip would bruise badly, Pride already had. "I'm all right." She got up, not gracefully. The dirt was on her dress, and her hair had come partly loose. She looked at Cora, who was watching her with that large, mild equine attention. "Let's do it again." She was aware of Hob watching from the fence. She was aware of Dunmore watching from further back, near the barn door, and she knew that what happened in the next 30 seconds mattered more than anything she had done in the house, or with the accounts, or with the supply orders. She mounted Cora again. When she came in from the corral that afternoon, she went straight to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat down and moved very carefully because the hip was already protesting. Scout came and put his head on her knee, and she scratched his ears absently and thought about what she had gotten herself into. The honest answer was that she wasn't certain. She had accepted Caleb's proposal with the practical, forward-facing part of her brain, and she had been operating from that part ever since, because it was the part that was useful. But she was 26 years old, and she had spent 19 days on a coach and a rail car, and she had been told she was plain in front of witnesses, and she was sitting in a stranger's kitchen with a bruised hip and ink on her fingers and a dog's head on her knee, 5 weeks into a 6-month agreement that had no guaranteed outcome. She was not unhappy. That was the thing she kept returning to with a faint sense of surprise. She was tired and sore and still socially uncertain, and operating from a deficit in almost every practical skill the ranch required. But she was not unhappy. There was a knock at the kitchen door, the side entrance the hands used. She said, "Come in," and it was Caleb, who had already cleaned up from the afternoon, and was carrying something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a heel of bread and a piece of hard cheese. "You didn't eat after the corral," he said. He set it on the table without ceremony and pulled back the other chair. "I wasn't hungry," she said, which was a lie, and she suspected he knew it was a lie. "You went 2 hours between meals and then fell off a horse," he said. "You should eat." She pulled the bread and cheese toward her. He sat. "The hip?" he said. "Bruised, it's fine. You should have said if you were done for the day." "I wasn't done." He looked at her steadily. No, I know, he wasn't being combative. He was being something else. She was still mapping the territory of his moods, and she was not finished. "You're going to be all right," he said then, on the horse. "You have the right instincts. You just haven't built the muscle memory yet. How long did it take you?" "I grew up on horses." Not a fair comparison. He picked at a splinter on the edge of the table, not looking at her directly. "When I first started running cattle, I lost an entire calf run because I made a routing mistake. 2 months of work. I didn't eat much that week either." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Because you're sitting there doing the thing where you add up everything you haven't mastered yet and compare it to some standard you've decided you should already meet." He said it without heat. I recognized the look. She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what I look like?" "Right now, yes." She ate some of the bread. It was good bread. Ruth Alderman had sent it over with a message about the Thursday women's meeting that Eliza had not yet decided whether to attend. "I'm not used to being the one who doesn't know how to do things," she said, which was more honesty than she usually distributed. "I know it's uncomfortable. Most learning is," he said. "You reorganized a pantry system in a day. You reconstructed 18 months of accounts in a night. You got back on the horse." He finally looked at her. "You're fine, Eliza. You're just not done yet." She ate the cheese. Scout's tail thumped against the floor. It was the first time she thought carefully, without drawing any conclusions, that the 6 months were going to feel different from what she had expected when she agreed to them. She could not have said exactly in what direction, but different. November tightened the air. The days shortened abruptly, and the cold came with a seriousness she had not experienced in Philadelphia, where winter was an inconvenience rather than an actual adversary. The ranch hands shifted into the particular rhythm of cold weather work, longer mornings, more urgent maintenance, a quality of attention to the sky that she noticed in all of them and began to develop herself. She learned to read the clouds the way Caleb read them, tracking the flat gray masses that came in from the northwest with a different weight than the regular overcast. "That kind means nothing," he told her one morning, pointing at a high, wispy cover. "That kind," pointing at the dense shelf building in the northwest, "means you check your firewood before noon." She checked her firewood before noon. It was a habit she kept. In town, the temperature of opinion had shifted somewhat, not toward warmth exactly, but toward a kind of provisional reassessment. She had attended the Thursday women's meeting twice, mostly because Ruth had asked her directly, and she had calculated that the social credit of going outweighed the discomfort of being watched. She said little at the meetings, and listened to a great deal, and she helped with the practical organization of a supply collection for a family outside town whose barn had burned, because organizing supplies was something she was actually good at, and because it was, regardless of social politics, simply the right thing to do. The woman whose barn burned was named Clara Veach, and she came to thank Eliza herself 2 days later, driving a wagon that had seen better decades, with 2 small children in the back. And she said simply, "I heard it was you who sorted the list," and Eliza said it was a group effort and offered her coffee. Clara came in and sat at the kitchen table, and they talked for an hour about nothing and everything, and when Clara left, she held Eliza's hand for a moment in the doorway and said, "You're good people," in the direct, unornamented way that frontier people said important things. Eliza stood on the porch after Clara's wagon disappeared and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. It was not the social credit she had calculated earlier. It was something that lived at a different level, and it was connected to the word Clara had used the word people, which included her in something, without requiring her to be anything other than what she already was. Caleb noticed she was quieter than usual at supper that evening. He noticed things like that she had learned this about him, the particular attentiveness that went so quietly that it could look like inattention if you weren't watching for it. He noticed, and he didn't ask which was the right response, and she had come to depend on it. She was the one who brought it up later, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and she was washing the supper dishes, and he was doing something at the table with a piece of harness that needed repair. "Clara Veach came today," she said. "I heard she was coming," he said. He was working a needle through leather. "How is she managing?" "Better than I expected, honestly. She's practical." Eliza set a plate on the drying shelf. "She thanked me. For the supply organization." "You deserved the thanks." "I wasn't sure." She stopped. Started again. "I wasn't certain the women in this town were ever going to see me as anything other than the woman Nathaniel Crow didn't want." The sound of the needle through leather stopped. "Clara Veach doesn't care what Nathaniel Crow wanted," Caleb said. "I know that now." Silence for a moment, the kind that had texture to it. "Does it bother you?" he said still. What he said. She kept her hands in the water. "Of course it does," she said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise. It would be dishonest." She picked up another plate. "But it bothers me differently than it did. When I'm in the middle of something useful, I stop thinking about it. The hours when I stop thinking about it are getting longer." "That's progress," he said. "It's something," she agreed. Hob knocked on the kitchen door a moment later with a question about the morning's schedule, which dissolved whatever had been building in the air between them, and Eliza she examined this carefully, not sure whether she was relieved or not. December arrived, and with it came Nathaniel. She had not expected it so soon. Caleb had told her Nathaniel came out to the ranch occasionally on business. They ran some shared grazing agreement on a strip of eastern land that required periodic discussion, and she had thought she was prepared for it when the day came. She found, standing in the kitchen doorway watching Nathaniel's buggy come down the track toward the house, that she was prepared in the rational sense, and not fully prepared in any other. He looked the same, tailored, maintained, the deliberate good looks she had observed for 4 seconds on the platform. He was looking at the house as he drove in, and then he saw her, and the expression on his face did something complicated that she clocked and set aside. Caleb came from the barn. She watched the 2 cousins exchange the brief, functional greeting of men who have history but not warmth. "Eliza," Nathaniel said, turning to her. His voice had something in it she couldn't quite define, not contrition, not quite. Something more uncomfortable than contrition, because contrition has a simple shape, and this didn't. "Mr. Crow," she said. "I didn't." He stopped, looked from her to Caleb and back. "I wasn't aware I didn't know you were staying." "Eliza manages the household," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her in a way that was casual and not at all casual. "She also keeps the accounts. The ranch is running better than it has in years." He said it without heat, which made it worse for Nathaniel than heat would have. Nathaniel stood with his hat in his hand and the December wind pulling at his coat and looked at Eliza, with the expression of a man who is understanding something late and finding the understanding unpleasant. She did not help him. She waited. "I see," he said finally. "Would you like coffee?" she said. "Perfectly pleasant." "You've had a cold drive," he said. Yes. He came inside. She made coffee and set it on the table and went back to her accounts and let Caleb handle the business conversation. She sat 3 feet away and worked with steady hands and did not let Nathaniel see that anything about the situation cost her anything at all. When he left an hour later, Caleb came back inside and stood in the kitchen and said nothing for a moment. "You were remarkable," he said. "I was polite," she corrected. "There's remarkable inside that politeness." She looked up from the accounts. He was looking at her with the gray-green eyes that were sharp and completely present, and the expression was the one she was still learning to read, the one that appeared sometimes in small, unguarded moments, and then went away before she had catalogued it properly. He came to assess the situation, she said. I didn't give him anything to assess that I didn't choose to. I know, Caleb said. That's what I mean. She went back to the accounts. Her handwriting did not shake. But for a moment, a small, strictly private moment, she let herself feel something that was adjacent to satisfaction, which was not the same as happiness, but was not entirely separate from it either. The weeks that followed had a particular quality she would remember afterward, not dramatic, not the kind of days that announced themselves, just days. Long, cold days with real work in them and real difficulty and small moments of unexpected rightness scattered between. Dunmore stopped making his particular face when she appeared in the barn. Morris, the oldest hand, started leaving her notes about things that needed ordering, written in the painstaking hand of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult, and she answered them in kind without comment about the spelling. Pete fixed the floor near the stove without being asked, which she took as a significant communication, even though no words accompanied it. She and Caleb fell into an evening rhythm without deciding to the supper hour. Then the hours after, when the house settles into something quieter, and the work of the day became something they moved through together without the particular performance that the daylight seemed to require. He talked about the ranch in those hours the way he didn't during the day, not reports, but thinking out loud. She talked about the accounts, the town, the things she was learning. Scout slept between them, redistributing his weight at regular intervals. She noticed sometime in December that she had stopped calculating how many weeks were left in the 6 months. She could not have said exactly when it happened. One day she was aware of it as a number and then she wasn't. And when she found herself aware that she had stopped counting, she sat with it for a while before she acknowledged what it probably meant. It was not something she was ready to examine directly. But it was there, whatever it was, the way the soft spot had been near the stove present, requiring eventual attention, impossible to pretend away indefinitely. She went back to work. There was always work. She had found, genuinely to her surprise, that she did not resent the work the way she had expected to. She had expected the frontier to feel like deprivation, the absence of the familiar, the comfortable, the intellectually stimulating. What she had found instead was that the work had a quality of purpose to it that was different from teaching grammar to girls who didn't want to learn it. The flower order mattered. The grain rotation mattered. Whether Pete had what he needed to fix the fencing before the hard freeze mattered. It was a smaller world than Philadelphia in most technical senses, and it was also, in ways she had not anticipated, a more real one. She was thinking about this, standing at the kitchen window in the early dark of a December afternoon, watching the first serious snow of the season come down in the slow, purposeful way of snow that intended to keep going, when Caleb came in from outside and stopped in the kitchen and looked at her looking out the window. "You all right?" he said. "I'm watching the snow," she said. He came and stood beside her, not quite touching, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold kitchen. They both looked out at the yard going white and the barn going hazy in the snowfall, and Scout doing his inspection circuit of the perimeter with his nose down, as if the snow required investigation. "First real one of the year," Caleb said. "Is it always this quiet when it starts?" "Usually." He was quiet for a moment. "You get used to it." She thought about getting used to it. She thought about the word "you" and whether it was general or particular. She did not ask. The snow kept coming down, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the ranch was going white and quiet, and neither of them moved away from the window for a long time. The snow that had started quietly in December did not stop being quiet. It deepened instead, over the weeks that followed, accumulating in the patient, indifferent way of weather that has no opinion about human plans and no interest in accommodating them. By January, the drifts along the north fence ran waist-high, and the mornings required an hour of work before the actual work of the day could begin clearing paths, breaking ice from the water troughs, checking that the livestock hadn't worked themselves into trouble overnight in the cold. Eliza had adjusted to this. That was the word she kept returning to, adjusted, not adapted, because adaptation implied something permanent, and she was still technically in the middle of a 6-month arrangement. But adjusted was accurate. Her body had reorganized itself around the cold in ways she hadn't expected. She woke earlier now without effort. She ate more without thinking about it. She moved differently, less like a woman managing herself through unfamiliar space, and more like a woman who understood where things were. She wore her hair differently, too, out of pure practicality, and her hands had changed in ways she noticed when she looked at them at the kitchen table, at night rougher, slightly raw at the knuckles from cold air and water and work. Nothing like the hands of a Philadelphia schoolteacher. She did not mind the hands. She had surprised herself with how much she did not mind. What she did mind and had not found a way to manage. was the quality of the feeling she carried when Caleb was in the same room. It had been developing through December with the same patient accumulation, as the snow not sudden, not dramatic, just steadily present in a way that couldn't be ignored once she had become aware of it. She was aware of it now. She was in fact aware of it constantly, in the specific, exhausting way of feelings that arrive before you've built adequate defenses. She was also aware that he noticed things. He noticed more than he said, and he said more than most people would have, and the combination was, she had found, somewhat unbearable. She did not examine what she meant by unbearable. There were 6 months, and the 6 months were not done, and the arrangement had terms, and she was a practical woman. January 3rd brought a new complication in the form of 3 feet of snow in 14 hours, and a temperature that dropped below what the thermometer on the porch post was designed to measure. Caleb said it was the worst early storm in 4 years. Dunmore, who had been at the ranch longer than anyone, said it was the worst in 6. They were both right in their respective ways, which was how frontier arguments tended to work. Everyone's measurement was accurate. The disagreement was about what the measurement meant. What it meant, practically, was that the cattle on the East Range were in trouble. Caleb came to breakfast on the morning of the 4th with the look she had learned to recognize as the one preceding bad news delivered without dramatics. He ate quickly and told her he needed to ride out to check the East herd. The water there froze faster than the West Range because of how the land lay, and there were 40 head that could develop serious problems in this temperature if nobody moved them. "When are you going?" she asked. "As soon as Pete and I can get the horses ready." "How long will it take?" "Depends on the condition of the trail. 4 hours, maybe 5 if there's drifting on the east axis." She looked out the window at the sky, which had the flat, pale quality that Caleb had told her in November meant more was coming. She had gotten good at reading that sky. "More snow this afternoon," she said. "Probably," he said. He didn't look at the sky. He was already thinking past it. "Take the rope from the barn," she said. "The long one, not the working rope. If you have to cross the creek bed in drifted snow." "I know the rope," he said. But he said it without dismissal. The way you say "I know" to someone who has told you something useful rather than something obvious. Pete appeared at the side door, and they were gone within the hour. 2 horses moving into the white and getting smaller and disappearing around the north tree line. And Eliza went back to the kitchen and looked at the thermometer through the window and told herself there was nothing to worry about because Caleb had done this kind of work his entire life and knew the land better than she knew the contents of her own trunk. She managed the morning. She cooked. She did the accounts. She helped Hob with a harness problem he brought to the kitchen door because his hands were too cold to manage the buckle properly. She started a pot of soup because there would be cold people back by afternoon. Scout stayed inside, which was unusual enough to notice. He was a working dog who preferred the cold to the heat of the kitchen, and he tracked her movements from room to room with an attention that went beyond his normal interest in whether food was being prepared. "You're nervous," she told him around midday. He put his ears back and then forward again. The snow started again at 2 o'clock, which was earlier than she had estimated. She looked out the window and calculated Caleb had left at 8:30, 5.5 hours ago, and 4 hours was the optimistic estimate, and 5 was the dependent on conditions estimate, and she did not know the conditions on the East Range. She waited another hour. The snow thickened. Hob knocked on the kitchen door to ask if she'd heard anything from Caleb, and the fact that Hob was asking told her the worry was not just hers. "Not yet," she said. "Trail's going to get hard with this much new snow," Hob said. He was trying to say it as information rather than concern, and not entirely succeeding. He was 19, and he looked it in that moment. "Caleb knows that trail," she said. "So does Pete." Hob nodded and left, and she stirred the soup and looked at the clock, and then looked at Scout, who was looking at the door. At 4 o'clock, Pete came back alone. She heard the horse first and went to the window and felt something go cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature when she counted 1 horse instead of 2. Pete came through the side door, with snow caked on his coat and his face drawn tight in the particular way of a man carrying information he does not want to give. "Where is he?" she said before Pete had fully gotten inside. "He went ahead on the south side to check the condition of the creek crossing," Pete said, just pulling at his gloves. "I went the long way with the cattle. The direct route wasn't passable with snow that deep. We were supposed to meet at the boundary marker." He stopped. "He wasn't there. How long did you wait?" 40 minutes. The snow was coming too hard, and the light was going. He looked at her. His eyes were flat with the effort of not showing what he was feeling. "I came back for more people." "Where could he be?" she said, not panicking. She could not panic yet. She needed information first. Pete spreaded out the possible routes, the creek bed, a section of the south trail that ran alongside a steep bank that could be treacherous in drifting snow, a stand of timber that he'd seen Caleb use as shelter in bad weather before. He talked and she listened, and she built a map of it in her head, the same way she built supply plans and account systems, methodical, spatial, looking for the logic of the terrain. Dunmore came in while Pete was still talking, Morris behind him. They conferred in low, quick voices, and she stood at the edge of the conversation and listened. And when they started talking about waiting until morning if the snow kept up, she said, "No." They looked at her. "You said he's on the south trail," she said. "You said the shelter stand is 1.5 miles from the boundary marker on the south side. If he's injured, he's been in below zero temperature for at least 2 hours." Miss Eliza Dunmore started. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, and she said it in a tone she had never used with him before, a tone that came from somewhere she had not known existed until this moment. "You know what 2 hours in that temperature means for a man who can't move. You're not waiting until morning." Silence. The kitchen was very quiet, except for the wind outside. "The storm's bad," Pete said carefully, not arguing. "I know the storm is bad," she said. "I've been watching it since 2 o'clock. She turned to the hook by the door and took down her coat. "Tell me exactly where the timber stand is, relative to the creek crossing, and which side of the bank he'd have been riding." Pete and Dunmore exchanged a look. She did not wait for the outcome of it. "I'm going," she said. "Tell me where to look or don't, but I'm going." "You can't ride the south trail alone in this," Dunmore said. "The bank section, then come with me." Another silence. Then Pete said, "I'll come." And Dunmore, after a moment that contained a private argument she was not privy to, said, "We all go. Hobbs stays with the horses here in case he comes back himself." She packed what she could in the time she had: blankets from the chest, the kit she had assembled in November out of practical foresight, some of which she had hoped never to need, the flask of something warming that Morris produced from somewhere without explanation. Scout was already at the door, weight forward, tail stiff. "He knows the trail," Pete said, looking at the dog. "Then he comes," she said. They went out into the white. She had been in bad weather before. She had walked to school through Philadelphia snowstorms. She had sat through the inadequate heating of the coach across the plains. She had felt the particular cold of the Colorado winter through the walls of the ranch house. She had not been in anything like this. The wind was coming from the northwest at an angle that made facing it directly nearly impossible, and the snow was not falling so much as moving horizontal and aggressive, filling the space in front of the horses before they'd fully created it. She tucked her chin down and followed Pete's horse, and tried to keep her bearings by maintaining the angle of the wind on her left cheek. Scout ran ahead and circled back at intervals, moving in the way of a dog who knows what he is looking for. The south trail was identifiable more by the lay of the land than by any visible path. 2 feet of fresh snow had eliminated the visual record of it, and she was dependent on Pete's knowledge of the route in a way that she noted and accepted, without the particular friction it might have generated in her a month ago. She had learned to depend on people at the ranch. It had been one of the harder things she had learned. The creek crossing appeared suddenly, the bank dropping away in front of Pete's horse, and the creek bed below it, a tangle of snow and ice and dark water, moving in the gap where the ice hadn't fully taken hold. Pete went left along the bank, which she understood from his account. Earlier was the direction toward the timber stand. They had gone maybe a 1/4 mile when Scout stopped. He stopped the way he stopped when he found something not uncertain, not confused, but fully committed, all 4 feet planted, and his nose pointed at something below the level of the trail on the bankside. She was off Cora before she had fully decided to dismount, which was not the careful, calculated movement she had become on horseback, but something faster and less considered. "There," she said. Below the bank edge, half hidden by the drifting snow, the dark shape of a horse and a man lay together at an angle that told her immediately and horribly what had happened. The bank had given way, or the horse had gone wrong in the snow, and they had gone down together. The horse was standing now. She registered with relief, though awkwardly, which might mean an injured leg, or might mean the footing. Caleb was not standing. She went down the bank, which was not a controlled descent, and she heard Pete and Dunmore behind her. And she reached Caleb, and her hands were on him before her feet were fully steady. He was alive. She felt the breath before she heard it, her hands finding his chest while the snow was still shifting around her from the descent. He was alive, and conscious enough to turn his face toward her, though the movement was slow and effortful in a way that frightened her more than unconsciousness might have, because it told her about the cold that had gotten into him. "Eliza," he said. His voice was wrong, thick, and imprecise in the way of extreme cold, the body pulling resources away from the periphery. "I'm here," she said. "Where are you hurt?" "Leg." He moved his right hand, a minimal gesture. "Right." The horse came down on it. She ran her hands down his right leg without hesitating, and found through the layers of clothing the irregularity she was looking for, not the terrible wrongness of a full break, but something in the lower region, shin or ankle, that he couldn't put weight on. She had read enough about injuries in the kit manual she'd found in the supply barn, to know the difference between what she could manage and what she couldn't, and she believed she was on the right side of that line. "Can you move your foot?" she said. A pause then. "Yes." "Does it feel like the bones are moving wrong? Or like pain?" "Pain," he said. "Just pain, all right." She sat back on her heels and looked up at Pete, who was beside her now. "I need the rope and both blankets. Dunmore, can you check the horse?" Dunmore was already at the horse's head, and he said, "She's okay, just spooked and cold," with the confidence of a man who knew horses, and she filed that away as one less problem. Getting Caleb up the bank was the worst 20 minutes she had experienced since arriving in Colorado, and she had experienced several candidates for that position. He could not bear weight on the leg, which meant Pete on one side and Dunmore on the other, and her behind them, with her hands on Caleb's back to counterbalance on the bank slope. And the snow was not cooperative, and neither was the bank. She heard Caleb make a sound at one point that she was fairly certain he would have prevented, if he'd had more control, and she kept her own voice steady and spoke in the practical, continuous way she'd learned, kept everyone, including herself, from focusing on fear. 3 more feet, she said. Pete, left side. Dunmore, there's a root under the snow there. That's solid footing. Caleb, push with the left if you can. Good. 2 more feet. They got him onto the trail. She had the blankets around him before Pete had finished catching his breath, and she had the flask from Morris, and she made Caleb drink from it. 3 swallows, which produced a long exhale and marginally better color in his face than she'd seen coming up the bank. "Can you ride?" she said. "I can try." He looked at her. The gray-green eyes were present and not fully present simultaneously, the particular quality of someone working harder than they should have to on basic functions. "You came out," he said. "Yes, they told you not to." "They came with me," she said. "That's different." She stood up. "Pete, I need the stirrup on the left side only. He'll mount left and not use the right." "Can you already on it?" Pete said. It took another 10 minutes to get Caleb mounted, and it wasn't clean. There was a moment at the stirrup where the leg protested, and he went white, and she put both hands on his arm and said very quietly, just to him, "You're going to make it. I know you are, look at me." And he looked at her, and whatever he found there steadied him enough to get the rest of the way up. The ride back was long and cold and quiet. She rode on Caleb's right side the entire way, close enough that she could see his face, and she watched him for the signs she had read about the dangerous drowsiness, the confusion, the fading of concentration, and kept him talking when he started to go quiet. She asked him about the east herd, about the creek crossing, about the horse, practical questions, things he could answer from habit if the thinking was getting hard. He answered all of them slowly, and the answers got slightly more coherent as the motion warmed him. Scout ran ahead all the way home. The ranch was lit up when they came, and Hob had lit every lamp, which she would remember later as both excessive and entirely right. He came running out of the barn and took the horses, and she could hear him talking to them the way he did, that particular continuous murmur, and she registered it as the sound of the ranch, functioning the way it was supposed to, and felt something ease in her chest that had been locked since 4 o'clock. She got Caleb into the house and onto the kitchen bench, which was the warmest place in the house by virtue of the stove, and she got his coat off and his boots and the heavy outer layer of clothing, and then she lit the extra lamp and looked at the leg properly. It was not a full break. The lower shin had taken impact and was swelling badly and would be extraordinarily unpleasant for several weeks, but the bone was intact as far as she could assess, nothing at a wrong angle, no grinding when she palpated carefully, which made him produce another controlled sound through his teeth. She wrapped it with what she had in the kit, tightly and correctly, because she had read the relevant section 3 times when she first assembled the kit, never imagining she would need it for him. He watched her work. "You read about this," he said. He was tracking her hands. "I read about a lot of things," she said. "Hold still. Where did you learn to do that?" "I haven't done it before." "I read about it. There's a difference, and also not entirely." She tied off the wrap and sat back. "It'll hold for tonight. You need a doctor to look at it properly tomorrow." 15 miles, he said. "Pete can go first thing. Or I can go." She picked up the lamp and looked at his face. Better color now. Eyes fully present. "How's the cold? Do you feel it coming back?" "Hands and feet are burning," he said. "That's good. That means circulation." She had read that too. The burning was the blood returning, which meant the dangerous cold hadn't gone too deep. She put her own hand over his briefly, checking the temperature of the skin, and his hand turned and held hers before she had registered that it was happening. She looked at their hands. "Eliza," he said. "You need to rest," she said. "I know." He didn't let go of her hand. "I know." He stopped. He was someone who chose his words carefully, and the cold had made that harder. She could see him working at it. "I need to say something." "Tomorrow," she said. "No," he said it quietly, but with the weight of someone who has made a decision. "I've been waiting to say it because it seemed like something that needed the right time. and I've just spent 2 hours in a snowdrift, and I've come to the conclusion that waiting for the right time is a very good way to run out of it." She looked at him. Her hand was still in his. "I love you," he said. Simple. No performance to it, no qualification, no architecture of words around the statement to make it easier to say or easier to take back. Just the words in his voice, which was still not fully, his still slightly thick with the cold and the effort and the evening, but was his enough. She was a woman who had been very careful about what she said and when she said it. She was a woman who had survived 2 failed engagements and 1 public rejection, and 3 years of careful, deliberate economy by being thoughtful before she was open. She was a woman who made lists and kept accounts and built systems for things, and generally knew what she was going to say before she said it. She said, "I know." He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I didn't know what to do with it." "Do anything with it," he said. I'm not demanding anything. I just needed you to know." "I know," she said again. And then, because she was also a woman who, when she had enough information, could make a decision, "I think I love you too. I'm not certain. I want to be certain before I say it as a fact." She looked at him steadily. "But I think so." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, and the lamps were burning, and outside the storm was finally starting to thin, the wind dropping its voice by increments. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She made him sleep in the sitting room, closer to the stove than the bedroom. On the cot, she set up with 2 extra blankets, and the specific instruction that he was not to attempt stairs. He agreed, which told her how much the evening had cost him, because Caleb Mercer in full health would have argued. She checked on him twice in the night, standing in the doorway with the lamp held low, watching his breathing until she was satisfied it was regular and untroubled. Scout slept on the floor beside the cot, which was not his usual place, and when she came in the second time and saw the dog's large pale shape settled next to Caleb's sleeping form, she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to and felt something that was not adjacent to happiness anymore, but was, as far as she could honestly assess it, actually happiness. She went back to bed and lay in the dark, and thought about what he had said and what she had said, and the particular quality of his voice when he said it, not performed, not strategic, simply true. She was not certain. She had said she was not certain, and that was honest. But lying in the dark in the ranch house that she had reorganized, in the bed she had slept in for 2.5 months, and listening to the wind drop outside the window, she did the careful accounting she always did, and looked at the figures. She had followed a man into a blizzard. She had gone down a snow-covered bank in the dark. She had wrapped his leg with hands that did not shake, because she had not let them shake, and she had kept her voice steady while she moved him because he needed her voice to be steady. And she had sat in the cold with his hand in hers, and felt something that was entirely beyond the bounds of their arrangement. She was a woman who was good with figures. She looked at these and did not find them ambiguous. In the morning, Caleb was pale but lucid and considerably irritated at his own helplessness, which she had also predicted, and which she handled by giving him the account ledger and 3 outstanding supply letters to draft, while she organized Pete's trip to town for the doctor. Giving him something to do with his hands turned out to be the right move. Though she would not have said she calculated it, she had simply known it, the way she now knew things about him that had accumulated over months of paying attention. Pete came back with Dr. Ames by midday, who examined the leg and confirmed her assessment with a thoroughness that involved considerably more probing than her careful palpation had, and produced the same controlled sounds from Caleb that she had heard on the bank. The bone was intact. The swelling would need 2 weeks of elevation and minimal movement, which Caleb received as news the way most men received news they didn't want, with a flat expression, and the specific silence of someone calculating how to disregard medical advice. "He'll try to get up too soon," Dr. Ames said to Eliza, in the kitchen, while she was making him coffee. "I know," she said. "He needs someone who'll tell him no." "I can do that," she said. The doctor looked at her. He was a compact, practical man in his 50s who had been doctoring this part of Colorado for 20 years, and had the specific worldliness of someone who had seen most kinds of trouble. He looked at Eliza the way people who had known Denison Creek for a long time looked at her, with the slight recalibration that said she was not what they had first expected. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "how did you find him?" "Scout," she said, "and Pete knew the trail. Pete told me what happened. He said you wouldn't wait till morning." She set the coffee down in front of him. "He was right that I wouldn't. Could have gone badly." "You know that, I know that," she said. "It didn't." He looked at her for another moment and then picked up his coffee and said, "Good instincts," in the tone of someone who doesn't give the assessment often. She went back to the sitting room where Caleb was and found him with the account ledger open and the supply letters finished, and a look on his face that was trying to be ordinary and not quite achieving it. She sat in the chair across from him, and they looked at each other in the particular way they had been looking at each other since last night, aware of what had been said, not yet certain what to do with the saying. "The doctor says 2 weeks," she said. "I know what the doctor says. I know that you know. I'm telling you so we're clear that I also know, and that I'll be watching." He almost smiled. "Of course you will. The East herd is fine, by the way. Dunmore checked this morning. All 40 head accounted for and moved to the West Range." "Good." He looked down at the ledger, then back at her. "Eliza. Last night. I know what you said last night," she said. "I know what I said. I haven't changed my assessment. I wasn't going to ask you to." He was quiet a moment. "I just wanted to make sure that in the daylight it's still," she said. The words sat between them in the warm sitting room, simple and specific and without any of the architecture of qualification she had built around most of the things she felt. She had not said, "I love you." She had said, "It's still," which meant the same thing, and also meant she was still moving towards certainty at her own pace, and that she expected him to understand that. He understood it. She could see that he did. Scout came in from the kitchen and settled between them, redistributing his weight with a long exhale that was almost comically satisfied. And Eliza looked at the dog and then at the man across from her and thought about the 6 months and where they stood inside of them and whether the counting still felt like something she was doing. It did not. She had known that since December, and she knew it more clearly now. What she hadn't known then, and was beginning to understand, sitting in the morning light with the storm finally gone outside and the ranch settling back into its ordinary sounds, was that the question was no longer whether she would stay. The question was what staying meant, what kind of choosing it was, what kind of person she was choosing to be, what kind of life this was that had built itself around her in 2.5 months without her fully noticing it happening. She picked up the nearest supply letter and read through what he'd written and made a small correction to a figure in the margin. "You added wrong on the 3rd line," she said. He looked at his own work. "I did. The total should be 42, not 40. You're right." He did not look particularly bothered by this. He was watching her in the way she had started noticing not the assessment of the early weeks, but something different, the way you watch something you've already assessed and come to a conclusion about and are now simply glad to be near. She was not entirely ready to name what she felt when she caught him looking at her that way. She was, however, starting to think she might be soon. She handed the letter back. Their fingers touched at the paper's edge briefly, and neither of them made anything of it, and neither of them had to. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt from the roof in long, slow drips that fell past the sitting room window at irregular intervals, and somewhere in the barn Hob was singing something tuneless and off-key that she could just hear through the wall, and the fire in the stove was doing what a good fire does not make in a production of itself, just keeping everything warm. The 2 weeks Caleb spent off the leg were the longest 2 weeks Eliza had observed him endure, and she had by that point observed him through considerable difficulty. He was not a good patient. She had suspected this before the injury, and the reality confirmed it thoroughly. He lasted 4 days on the cot in the sitting room before he moved himself to the kitchen bench, which was closer to the door and therefore closer to the ranch, which she understood was the actual motivation, even though he presented it as a preference for better light. He lasted 3 more days on the kitchen bench before she came in from the barn one morning to find him standing at the window with his weight distributed in a way that was supposed to look casual and did not. "Caleb," she said. "I'm standing," he said. "I'm not walking anywhere. You're favoring the left to the point where you're going to create a second problem in your hip if you keep doing it." He looked at her. She looked back. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. Not because she told him to, she understood this distinction, but because he had looked at her face and found something there that made arguing seem like the wrong investment of effort. She wasn't certain exactly what her face was doing, but it had been producing this effect with increasing reliability over the past weeks, and she had stopped questioning it. She brought him the supply catalog and the letters she needed him to sign, and he worked through them at the kitchen table with the focused irritability of a man redirecting energy that would rather be used elsewhere. She worked across from him on the accounts. Scout lay between them under the table, occasionally resting his chin on one foot and then the other with what appeared to be democratic intention. This was their life those 2 weeks. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of time that announced itself as significant while it was happening. It was coffee and account books and Hobbs' off-key barn singing coming through the walls and Dunmore's boots on the porch every morning when he came to update Caleb on the herd and the fencing and the particular ongoing argument with the north gate latch that had been a fixture of ranch life since before Eliza arrived. It was Caleb's leg getting better by increments she could see, but he could not feel quickly enough, and Eliza learning, in the proximity of those quiet indoor weeks, things about him she had not had occasion to learn during the busier months. She learned that he had been building the ranch alone for 9 years because he had arrived in Colorado at 22 with a specific idea about what he wanted and the specific stubbornness required to outlast the distance between wanting and having. She learned that he had taught himself double-entry bookkeeping from a manual because he couldn't afford to hire it done and didn't trust the imprecision of single entry, which explained certain things about the account ledger that had puzzled her when she first found it. It was not the system of a careless man, but of a self-taught one, which was different. She learned that he didn't sleep particularly well either, which she discovered on the 4th night when she came to the kitchen at 2 in the morning for water and found him at the table with a lamp and a piece of paper he was using to work out a fencing plan for the spring. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them made anything of the hour. "The north section," he said, turning the paper so she could see. "If we move the line 15 feet east, we gain access to the secondary water source without crossing Alderman's boundary." She sat down and looked at the paper. She had a good spatial sense she had discovered this about herself at the ranch, along with the riding and the grain rotation, and the particular skill of negotiating with Pete about the supply schedule, and she could read his hand-drawn lines well enough. "You lose the wind shelter on the northwest," she said. "The cattle congregate there in bad weather." He looked at the paper. "I hadn't considered the wind shelter. You were thinking about water. Makes sense." She picked up the pencil from the table and drew a line. "If you moved it here instead, 10 feet east on the north end, straight line south, you keep the shelter, and you still get within reach of the secondary source." He looked at what she'd drawn. He looked at it for a long time. "That's better," he said. "It solves one problem and doesn't create another. That's usually the standard." He looked at her over the lamp. "Where did you learn to think about land like that?" "I didn't. I thought about it like a supply problem. The cattle need water and wind shelter. Those are both resources. You allocate the fence line to access both rather than one." Yes, that's exactly right." He sat back. "You make things very clear." "I make clear things clear," she said. "It's different." He smiled, the real one, the one that appeared without preparation, and was therefore the one she trusted. She went and got her water and went back to bed, and she lay in the dark thinking about the smile, and about the 2 in the morning, and about the fact that they were both people who woke at 2 in the morning and went to the kitchen table, which was a small thing and also she had found not small at all. By the end of the 2nd week he was walking with a cane. Pete had fashioned from a branch of a fallen tree, rough-hewn and functional and entirely characteristic of Pete's particular approach to problem-solving. By the beginning of the 3rd week, he was at the corral fence, supervising what he was not yet supposed to be doing himself, which she allowed, because the supervision was keeping him from attempting the doing. By the start of February, he was working at half capacity, which for Caleb Mercer was the equivalent of most men's full, and she stopped tracking the leg as a primary concern. What she was tracking instead was the 6 months. She was aware of them again, not the way she had been in the beginning, counting down or counting toward, but with a different quality of attention. She had said in the sitting room, the morning after the blizzard, that she hadn't changed her assessment. She had sat still. She had meant it when she said it, and she meant it more now, and the thing she was doing with that meaning was something she could only describe as settling the way a well-made structure settles into its foundation. Not falling, but finding its permanent position. She had concluded, not leaving at the end of 6 months. She had not said this to Caleb. She was waiting, without being entirely certain what she was waiting for. Not for him to ask, he had already said what he had to say on the kitchen bench, half hypothermic, with more honesty than most people produced in their most carefully prepared moments. She was waiting, she thought for herself, for the certainty she had told him she needed before she said it as a fact. She was getting close to it. The particular morning it arrived was not dramatic, which she thought later was appropriate. It was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of February, cold but clear, the kind of Colorado winter day that offers sharp light and no wind as if in compensation for the previous month's weather. She had been out to the barn to check on a mare who had shown signs of illness the night before she had learned enough of animal husbandry to do basic assessment, though she still deferred to Pete and Dunmore for anything serious, and the mare was better, eating without reluctance, and Eliza was standing in the barn doorway, looking at the yard and the house and the outbuildings and the pale winter sky above all of it when she understood, without anything announcing itself, that she was looking at her life. Not a temporary situation, not an arrangement with terms. Her life. She stood there for a moment with the cold on her face and Scout beside her, and the barn smell of hay and animal warmth at her back, and she felt very clearly and without complication that she was home. Not the home she had imagined in Philadelphia, not the home she had been told to want, not any version of home that had been described to her by anyone. This one. This particular cold, clear morning with this view and these people and this dog and this difficult, excellent man who was at the moment visible through the corral fence, doing something with the north gate latch that was going to aggravate his leg if he didn't stop. "Caleb," she called. He looked up. "Leave the gate," she said. "Pete said he'd fix it this afternoon." He looked at the gate. He looked at her. He left the gate. She went inside and started the coffee, and knew what she was going to say when the time was right. And for once in her life, she was not anxious about how to say it. The words felt very simple. They were. The time turned out to be the following Saturday, which arrived with the particular quality of a day that has decided to be good clear sky, temperature above freezing for the first time in 6 weeks, the light at an angle that made everything look slightly more resolved than it actually was. Caleb had been quiet through breakfast in the way that was different from his working silences, and when she asked him, directly, what was occupying him, he said, "Come with me."
"I want to show you something."
He took her on horseback, which she could now do with a competence that no longer required her to concentrate on each individual action. He rode slowly because of the leg, and she matched him without comment. He took a route she hadn't traveled before, north, and then ascending gradually along a trail that wound between scrub and rock until the land opened onto a ridge she hadn't known was there. Below them, the ranch spread out in the winter light, the house, the barns, the corral, the fence lines running in their careful geometry across the white ground, the trail to town disappearing into the distance, the whole of it visible from above in a way that made its shape clear. It was not large, by the measure of some ranches she had heard about. It was exactly the size of 9 years of specific stubborn effort, and from the ridge that was visible too. She looked at it for a long time. Caleb sat beside her on his horse and was quiet, which was one of the things she had come to depend on, the quality of his silences, the way they had weight and intention without pressure. "I brought you here because I wanted you to see it from outside," he said finally. "The whole of it. I wanted you to see what you're being asked to." He stopped. Started again, which was unusual for him. "What I'm hoping you might want." She turned to look at him. He was not a man who performed things. She had learned this about him thoroughly. What she saw on his face now was not performance. It was the particular exposure of someone who has decided that the cost of not saying something outweighs the cost of saying it wrong. "What began as an impulsive thing," he said, "on a train platform. When I had no plan and just I couldn't let you get back on a coach and disappear. I didn't have a reason I could have explained at the time." He looked down at his horse's neck and then back at her. "I have reasons now. I have a considerable number of them." "Let me finish," he said. "I've been working up to this for a while, and if you interrupt me, I'll lose the thread." He said it with a flatness that was actually the frontier equivalent of vulnerability, and she understood it as such, and waited. "You came here and you fixed the pantry, and you fixed the accounts, and you got back on the horse after you fell off it, and you sat in a kitchen with Nathaniel Crow and gave him nothing he didn't deserve, and you went out into a blizzard and came back with me when you could have waited in the house and been entirely reasonable and correct to do so." He paused. "You changed what this place is. Not the ranch was always going to be all right. But what it is to come in from a day's work and sit at that table. What it is to think about something difficult and know there's someone who will think about it clearly and honestly alongside you." He stopped again. "You changed what this is for me." She kept her eyes on him. "The 6 months," he said. "The end of them is coming. And I know what I said, what we agreed that you'd decide it's the end. That it was your choice." His jaw tightened slightly. "The effort of continuing. I'm not asking you to decide because the agreement says to. I'm asking because I want a different agreement. A permanent one." He looked at her directly. "Eliza Hart, will you marry me? Actually marry me, not the arrangement me. For the rest of whatever this turns out to be." He reached into his coat. What he produced was a ring, small gold, set with a dark red stone that caught the winter light in a specific way. He held it, without ceremony, the way he held most things, without making a production of the holding. "It was my mother's," he said. I think she'd have liked you. She didn't suffer fools, and she didn't like people who pretended. You'd have gotten along." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at the ranch below them, spread out in the pale February light, and she thought about a Tuesday morning in a barn doorway, and a clear, cold sky, and the word home that had arrived without announcement. She had the certainty she had told him she needed. She had had it for 3 weeks. She had simply been waiting for this moment, which she had not known she was waiting for, but recognized immediately when it arrived. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. Just for a moment, before he did anything else, he simply looked at her, and she thought she understood it was the same thing she had needed on the barn doorway morning. The pause before the fact became real. The breath before you let yourself believe the figures you're looking at. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were not entirely steady. She noted this, and it was the detail she would remember most clearly in the years that followed, not the ring or the light or the view, but the slight unsteadiness of his hands, which told her something true about what the moment cost him. and which she valued more than any performance of composure would have been worth. I was going to tell you soon, she said, that I'd decided. When? 3 weeks ago, in the barn. I looked at the ranch and I understood that it was... She paused. I don't have a better word than home. He was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks, he said. I told you I needed to be certain. You were certain 3 weeks ago. I was certain 3 weeks ago, she agreed. I was waiting for the right moment to say it as a fact. And this is the right moment. You're on one knee on a mountain ridge with your mother's ring, she said. Yes, Caleb, this is the right moment. He laughed, the short, caught-off-guard sound she had first heard at the kitchen table in December. He was still holding her hand, the ring warm now from both their skin. We should get back, she said. Your leg. My leg is fine. Your leg is considerably better than it was and not yet what it will be. And you've been on horseback for an hour. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that were sharp and completely present, and the expression that was the one she trusted most. You're going to do this for the rest of my life, he said. Keep account of my own body better than I do. Someone has to, she said. You're not particularly reliable at it. No, he agreed. I'm not. They rode down from the ridge together, and she turned her left hand on the reins occasionally to feel the slight weight of the ring, which was unfamiliar and not unpleasant, like a word in a language she was beginning to learn. The ceremony was 3 weeks later, which was as long as it took to arrange what needed arranging, and not a day longer. She had no patience for extended preparation. And he had less. It was not large. Ruth Alderman came, and Clara Veach, and the Six Hands, and Dr. Ames, and 2 or 3 other people from town who had come to know Eliza over the months, and had made the trip in early March weather out of something she believed was genuine rather than social obligation, because people in frontier towns generally didn't do things out of social obligation when the weather was bad. Nathaniel was not invited. This was not discussed. It was simply not something either of them did, and the not doing of it was its own kind of statement. The ceremony was brief and honest, conducted by the justice of the peace who came from Denison Creek, and who had the practical, unadorned manner of a man who had married people in kitchens and barnyards and open fields, and understood that the location was not the point. She wore her better dress, the one she had brought from Philadelphia, which she had altered slightly at the waist and sleeves over the winter months, not because she'd planned to be married in it, but because the alterations needed doing, and she was practical. Caleb wore the coat she had noticed was his good one. She had learned to read his wardrobe the way she read supply stock, by presence and absence and condition. She was not nervous. She had examined this carefully, expecting to find anxiety somewhere in the architecture of the morning, and found instead something that was much closer to resolution, the feeling of a calculation completed, the feeling of having looked at the figures honestly and found them sound. Caleb was slightly nervous. She could see it in the way he stood, weight shifted, the same posture as on the platform the first day, which she had read then as inattention, and understood now as the posture he adopted, when something mattered more than he wanted it to show. She found this quietly and privately to be one of the best things about him. When it was done, Ruth Alderman produced a cake from somewhere, which she had clearly planned for without telling anyone, and Clara Veach had brought something in a jar that turned out to be extraordinarily strong and extremely welcome. Hobbs sang something that was ostensibly celebratory and as off-key as everything else he sang. Dunmore shook her hand with a firmness that said more than he would have been able to put into words, which was exactly what she had come to expect from Dunmore, and which she appreciated accordingly. Pete, who was not a man of many words on the best of days, looked at her for a moment and then said, "Good," and she thought that was perhaps the most complete sentence anyone had offered her on the subject. Scout wore a piece of ribbon tied loosely around his neck, which Hobb had put there, and which Scout bore with the dignity of a dog who has decided tolerance is the appropriate response to human enthusiasm. The day wound down the way good days do not dramatically but gradually, the people finding their way to their horses and wagons, and the temperature dropping toward its evening position, and the lamps coming on in the windows one by one, until the house was warm, and lit from the inside, and outside was the dark of a clear Colorado night with more stars than she had ever seen in Philadelphia, which was a thing she had stopped being surprised by, and had started simply accepting as the particular gift of living somewhere. The sky was not obscured by other people's lights. She stood on the porch after the last wagon had gone, in her good dress with her coat over it, and the cold sharp on her face, and she looked out at the dark yard and the darker hills beyond it. Caleb came to stand beside her. He had his bad leg canted slightly, which she noted and did not mention, because the day had been a long one and she was choosing her interventions. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "I'm thinking about the platform," she said. "That first day. I've thought about it a good deal," he said. "What I should have. I'm not thinking about what you should have done," she said. "I'm thinking about what he said, and where I'm standing now." She looked at the hills. I was 26 years old and I had $4, and he told me in front of half the platform that I wasn't worth his time. She paused. And I'm standing here. You are, Caleb said. I wasn't sure I had this in me. This particular life. She said it carefully because it was true and because she wanted to say true things on this day. I thought I was the kind of person who managed adequately, who made things work without them being quite right. And this, she looked at the house, the barn, the fence lines she had watched Pete build through the winter from the kitchen window. This is quite right. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then he took her left hand, where his mother's ring sat warm from the house in the day, and he held it the way he had on the mountain ridge, not performing anything, simply holding. He was wrong, he said. Nathaniel. What he saw in 4 seconds and thought he understood. He was wrong about everything. I know that now, she said. I knew it before. But knowing something and feeling it as entirely true, they take different amounts of time. And now? She looked at the sky. The stars were out in the full, extravagant way of clear February nights at altitude, more than the eye could organize into any pattern that made sense. Now I feel it, she said. He kept holding her hand. The cold was settling in properly, and they should both go inside. And in a moment they would. But for now they stood on the porch of the ranch house that had been built in stages by a man with good intentions and inconsistent time, and that she had reorganized from the pantry outward, and she let the moment have its full weight before it became memory. She was no longer the woman on the platform. She was not the woman Nathaniel Crow had looked at for 4 seconds and found insufficient. She was not the woman who had arrived with $4 and 2 dresses, and her mother's silverware, and the particular stubborn pride that had kept her standing when she should have sat down. She was all of those women, actually. She carried all of them. But she was also, and primarily, and in the way that mattered most, the woman standing on this porch with this ring on her finger and this man's hand around hers, in the cold of a Colorado night that was hers in every sense the word could hold. Inside, Scout was waiting at the door with his large, patient attention trained on the place where they would come back through, because that was what Scout did. He kept account of where everyone was and waited for them to return, and he was in this as in most things entirely reliable. She turned toward the door. Come inside, she said. You're favoring the leg again. I'm not. You've been favoring it for the last 20 minutes. He looked down at his feet with the expression of a man who has been fairly caught. Possibly, said inside, she said. He came inside. She followed him, and she closed the door behind her on the cold and the stars and the dark hills, and all the miles between this place and a train platform in October, and the house was warm and lit and entirely, completely hers. Spring came to the Mercer Ranch the way it always did in Colorado, not gently, not with any of the gradual warming that people from the east expected, but in argument with the winter, the 2 seasons pushing against each other for weeks, until one morning the cold simply failed to return, and the ground started doing what ground does when it has been frozen long enough, and is finally reluctantly allowed to be otherwise. Eliza noticed spring the way she now noticed most things at the ranch, not as an event, but as an accumulation of small details that added up to a fact. The mud first, which was its own kind of difficulty, the yard becoming a problem she had to account for in her morning routes. Then the particular quality of the light changing, arriving earlier and staying later in increments so small they were only noticeable in retrospect. Then the sound of the creek, audible from the kitchen window on quiet mornings, running fuller and faster as the snowmelt came down from the higher ground. Then the horses, who had a specific restlessness in early spring that Pete said meant they could smell the grass coming before it was actually there. She was 6 months pregnant by the time the mud dried enough to make the yard manageable again, which meant she had been pregnant through the worst of the winter without knowing it for the first 2 months, and then knowing it and keeping the knowledge close while she adjusted to it the way she adjusted to most new. Variables methodically, without panic, with a list. The list for the baby was the most comprehensive list she had ever made. Caleb had found it on the kitchen table one evening, and read through it with an expression that moved from focused attention something to something she could only describe as overwhelmed, which was not an expression she saw on him often. This has 47 items, he said. 49, she corrected. I added 2 this afternoon. Eliza, the baby isn't coming for another 3 months, which is why we have 3 months to address 49 items, she said. She took the list back. The cradle needs to be built before the ground gets too hard for Hob to dig the timber footings for the addition. The addition needs to be done before August, because I'm not sharing a room with a newborn and all of our current belongings with no dedicated space. I know about the addition. Pete thinks 4 weeks if Dunmore helps. Dunmore will help if you ask him directly and don't assign him to it, which I know is a distinction that matters to him. Caleb looked at her. He had the expression he sometimes wore when she had covered territory he was still arriving at, not behind exactly, but aware that she had gotten there first. I was going to ask him directly, he said. Good, she said. Then we agree. He shook his head, slow, in the particular way that meant he was not disagreeing but was experiencing the specific sensation of being thoroughly understood by another person. She had come to recognize this expression. She did not find it unpleasant. The addition went up in May, Pete and Dunmore, working with the focused efficiency of men who had been told clearly what was needed and by when, and who had enough respect for Eliza at this point to treat her deadline as non-negotiable. Hobb helped on the days when his regular work allowed it, and he was less skilled than the older men but made up for it in enthusiasm and a genuine inability to do a sloppy job without looking personally aggrieved, which she had decided was a trait worth cultivating in a young man. She supervised from the porch on the days when the work was within sight, not because she didn't trust them, but because she found, in the middle months of the pregnancy, that sitting still was harder than moving, and moving too far was harder than sitting still, and watching the addition take shape from the porch was the particular middle ground her body had negotiated for itself. Caleb checked on her at intervals that he tried to make look casual and that she allowed to look casual, because the alternative was a conversation about whether she needed checking on that would cost them both energy they could spend on other things. He brought her water without being asked. He moved the porch chair to follow the shade as the morning progressed. He did these things quietly, the same way he did most things that mattered without announcing them, without requiring acknowledgement, simply doing them because they needed doing, and he had noticed. She loved him more thoroughly at 6 months pregnant than she had thought she was capable of loving anyone, which surprised her in the specific way that the ranchette itself had surprised her, not by being something she hadn't imagined, but by being better than the imagining in ways she hadn't known to account for. It was on a Thursday afternoon in early June, while she was at the kitchen table working through the summer supply projections, that the sound of a horse in the yard made Scout raise his head from the floor with the specific attention he reserved for unfamiliar approaches. She looked out the window and felt her stomach do something complicated that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. Nathaniel Crow tied his horse at the post and stood for a moment in the yard looking at the addition, at the new fence line Pete had put in along the east boundary, at the yard that was clean and organized in ways it had not been the first time he had come out here in December. Then he looked at the house. He had the posture of a man who has rehearsed something and is not certain the rehearsal was adequate. She was at the door before he had finished crossing the yard. He looked at her. She watched him register the pregnancy, the particular moment of recalibration she had become accustomed to in people seeing her for the first time in months, and she watched him work through whatever he was thinking about that and set it aside. Eliza, he said. He had stopped using Miss Hart after the wedding, which she thought showed a modest degree of social awareness. Nathaniel, she said, is there a problem with the land agreement? No. He turned his hat in his hands. No, that's no. I came to speak with you. Both of you if Caleb's available. He's at the north fence. Pete can get him. She stepped back from the door. Come in. She made coffee because it was what she did when people came to the kitchen, and because having something to do with her hands gave her the few minutes she needed to settle whatever the complicated thing in her stomach was doing. Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table she had bought from the Aldermans after Ruth mentioned they were replacing theirs a better table than the original, larger, stained dark, the kind of table a family ate at. He looked at it briefly and then looked at his hat. Caleb came in 20 minutes later with mud on his boots and the specific expression of someone who's been told something on the way in and is working out how to feel about it. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel stood up, which was the first genuine show of deference she had seen from him in any context. Caleb, he said. Nathaniel. Caleb's voice was even. He crossed to the basin and washed his hands and came to the table and sat down without ceremony. He did not ask Nathaniel to sit. Nathaniel sat anyway after a moment. The three of them were quiet for the space of several seconds, which Eliza allowed to run its course rather than filling it. My engagement ended, Nathaniel said. In February, he said it to the table, not to either of them. Miss Hargrove, she found someone else, someone who he stopped. Doesn't matter the reason. The point is that it ended. He looked up. And in the months since, I've had a good deal of time to think about things, about patterns of behavior, he stopped again. This was, she realized, as genuinely difficult for him as anything she had watched him do. And Nathaniel Crow was not a man who found difficulty easy to sit with. Go ahead, she said, not encouraging, simply allowing. I want to apologize, he said. He looked at her directly, which cost him something visible, for what I said on the platform, how I said it. I treated you as I evaluated you the way I would evaluate a transaction, and I said what I concluded out loud, in public, without any regard for the fact that you were a person standing in front of me who had traveled a very long way to be there. He paused. That was wrong. It was cruel and it was wrong, and I have been aware of it for longer than I've been willing to admit. The kitchen was very quiet. Scout was under the table and she could feel his weight against her foot. She looked at Nathaniel. She had thought about this moment not obsessively, not in the bitter, compulsive way of unresolved injury, but in the honest, clear-eyed way she thought about most things. She had thought about what she would say, and she had thought about what it would feel like, and she had thought about whether it mattered. It mattered less than she had expected it to, which was itself a kind of information. "I accept your apology," she said. He blinked, as if he had expected something else. "More conditions, perhaps, more time. That's thank you," he said. "I want to be clear about something, though," she said. "Not for your benefit, for mine." She kept her voice level. "What you said on that platform was the worst thing anyone has said to me in my presence in my life. Not because you found me unattractive. People are allowed to find each other unattractive. That's not cruelty. It was the way you turned away from me as though I wasn't there, as though I had already ceased to exist for you." She paused. "I spent a good deal of the months afterward managing the weight of that. I won't pretend I didn't." Nathaniel was very still. "But I also want to be honest," she continued, "which is that I am sitting in this kitchen, in this house, on this ranch that is mine, with my husband across the table and a child coming in 2 months, and I am deeply all right, Nathaniel. I am better than all right." She looked at him steadily. "What you did on that platform sent me down a road I would not have found otherwise. I'm not telling you to thank you for it. I'm telling you so that you don't leave here carrying the weight of having ruined something. You didn't ruin anything." Caleb was looking at her. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel. "You redirected something," she said. "That's different." Nathaniel sat with that for a moment. She watched him process it, not with the easy relief of someone let off a hook, but with the more complicated expression of someone being given more grace than they had prepared for and finding it harder to receive than the condemnation would have been. "I was blind," he said. "I see that now." What I'd dismissed in 4 seconds, he looked at the table. Caleb saw it immediately. "I've had to reckon with that." "I didn't see it immediately," Caleb said, which surprised both of them. "I saw enough not to walk away." "That's different from seeing clearly." He looked at Nathaniel with the specific directness of someone who has thought about what he wants to say and is saying exactly that. "She's the one who built this. I had a leaking operation and an instinct not to let her get back on a coach. She turned it into something. That's not my perception of her, that's what happened." Nathaniel looked at Caleb for a moment, and then he looked around the kitchen, the organized shelves, the proper account books on the side table, the herbs she had started drying that hung from a beam Pete had installed at her request, and she saw him absorbing it with the particular expression of someone encountering evidence they had not expected. "The whole county talks about how well this ranch is running," Nathaniel said. "Pitts at the general store told me your supply arrangement saved him money too, because you consolidated orders, and he could manage his stock better. Torrance Brothers wrote me, because they knew we were cousins, asking if the woman at the Mercer ranch would be willing to advise on the ordering system for the Henderson operation." She raised an eyebrow. "When was this, March?" "No one told me." "I wasn't sure it was my place to pass along," Nathaniel said, and there was something slightly uncomfortable in his voice that she identified as belated awareness of the irony. She filed this away. "I'll write to the Hendersons," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. I'm interested." She looked back at Nathaniel. "Is there anything else?" He had been expecting the conversation to be harder and longer. She could see he had come prepared for a reckoning that had turned out to be a different shape than expected. He turned his hat once more in his hands and then set it on the table. "I owe you a great deal more than an apology," he said. "I know that." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "The accounting between us is settled as far as I'm concerned." She looked at him honestly. "What you might consider, and this is not a demand, I want to be clear, is whether the patterns you used on that platform appear in other parts of your life, in your banking, and how you assess people's creditworthiness, and what you decided to dismiss before looking properly." She said it without heat. "Not my business, but worth thinking about." Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. "You're right," he said. "I know you're right." He left an hour later, having drunk 2 cups of coffee, and talked with Caleb about the land agreement and the eastern boundary question that had been pending since winter. And when his horse disappeared down the track toward town, Eliza stood at the kitchen window for a moment and did her accounting. She had expected to feel more. She had expected Nathaniel's apology to cost her something, or give her something significant, had expected it to have the weight of a major event. What she felt instead was a mild, clean settling, the way a room feels after you have opened the windows and let the stale air out. Not dramatic, simply better. "Are you all right?" Caleb said. He was beside her at the window. "Yes," she said. "I think I've been all right about him for a while. I just didn't know it until just now." "What you said to him," Caleb said, "about the platform sending you down a road you wouldn't have found otherwise." He paused. Did you mean that? She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the gray-green eyes, and the expression that was his most unguarded one, the one that appeared when he wanted the actual answer rather than the reassuring one. Yes, she said. I meant every word of it. She put her hand on the curve of her stomach where the baby had been making its opinions known about the length of the kitchen conversation in the form of a series of decisive movements. I needed exactly the thing that happened to me to end up exactly here. I can be angry about how it happened and grateful for where it led. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He put his hand over hers on the warm curve of the coming summer and the coming child. No, he said, they're not. July was the hardest month she had experienced at the ranch, which was saying something given the competition from January. But July had the particular difficulty of heat and physical restriction, and the specific impatience of waiting for something enormous that was going to happen on its own schedule without consulting hers. She was not good at waiting. She had never been good at waiting. She managed the accounts and the correspondence in 2 letters to the Henderson operation about supply organization, and she drove herself to town twice before Caleb asked her not told, asked to let Pete drive her instead, and she agreed because she was, by the end of July, willing to accept reasonable assistance in a way that the earlier version of herself would have found much harder. Dr. Ames came out in the first week of August and told her everything was proceeding normally, which she had already assessed herself, but appreciated having confirmed. He had developed the habit of addressing his medical remarks to both her and Caleb simultaneously, which she appreciated because it was how she had always thought information should be shared. The baby came on the 14th of August, which was a hot, clear day with no wind, the kind of day that simply sits on the land and waits alongside everything else. Clara Veach was there. She had become a genuine friend over the months, the easy, undemanding kind that frontier life occasionally produced, built on practical cooperation rather than social proximity. And Ruth Alderman came because Ruth appeared at significant events as reliably as weather. Dr. Ames was there. Caleb was in the house and not in the room, because she had told him clearly that she needed him close and not present simultaneously, which was a distinction she expected him to understand and which he did. It was hard and long, and not the way anyone described it in the books she had read, which she had expected, because most books were written by people who were not there or who remembered it with the selective mercy of time. Clara held her hand. She was not graceful about it. She was sweating and frightened in the private, controlled way she was frightened at things, and at one point she said something she would not repeat in polite company, which made Clara laugh with such genuine delight that it steadied her more than anything else could have. Samuel Mercer arrived in the afternoon, in the particular way of babies who have decided on their timing without consultation, and he was red-faced and loudly opinionated from the first moment, which Dr. Ames said was an excellent sign, and which Eliza thought sounded like someone she was already going to understand. She heard Caleb in the hallway, not his words, just his voice, the low, steady register of it, asking something, and she said, loud enough to carry through the door, "Come in." He came in. He looked at her and then at the baby and then at her again, and she watched his face do something she had no adequate word for. She had seen him in a blizzard, and at the end of an extremely difficult conversation, and at the top of a mountain ridge asking her to marry him, and she had not seen his face do this before. It was the unguarded version of him, taken entirely apart and reassembled around a new fact, and it was, she thought, the most honest thing she had ever seen on another person's face. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Samuel, who was wrapped and red and furious about the general indignity of his situation. "He's angry," Caleb said. "He has opinions," she said. "I think he gets that from me." Caleb looked at her. She looked back at him. Samuel continued expressing himself at volume. "Samuel," she said. She said it to the baby directly, the same way she talked to Scout, as if being understood was a reasonable expectation. "You're all right. You're home." Samuel did not immediately quiet, but he shifted and turned his head, and the volume reduced by enough increments to constitute a response. Caleb put one large, careful hand on Samuel's head. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Outside, she could hear Pete and Hobbs somewhere in the yard, and Scout's nails on the porch boards, and the particular quality of an August afternoon, settling toward evening. The ranch was doing what it always did, its ordinary, continuous work of existing, livestock and fence lines, and the creek running its course in the distance, and the addition Pete had built, standing solid alongside the original house, all of it carrying on. Eliza lay in the bed she had slept in for 9 months, with her husband beside her, and her son in her arms, and the window open to the Colorado summer, and she thought about a train platform in October and 19 days of traveling and $4 and her mother's silverware at the bottom of her trunk. She thought about the woman who had stood on that platform. She thought about her often not with pity, not with the particular looking back sentiment that turned the past into something softer than it was. With clarity. The woman on the platform had been real, 32 days from losing both parents, alone in a practical and total sense, with a specific stubborn dignity that was the only unearned thing she'd ever had. That woman had been remarkable in ways she hadn't known. She had not known because no one had ever told her, and because the world she came from was one in which a woman's worth was a thing other people determined. What she knew now was that the world she lived in had a different set of measurements. She had built the supply system that Pitts credited for his own improved margins. She had reconstructed 18 months of accounts from a tin box of receipts. She had gone down a snow-covered bank in the dark and come back up it with a man who would have died without her, and she had done it with hands that did not shake, and a voice that stayed steady because they needed her to be steady, and she decided to be. She had stood in Nathaniel Crow's presence and given him grace she was not obligated to give, not because she was asked to, not because it made her look good, but because she had assessed the situation clearly and found it to be the true thing to do. She had done all of this as herself, not as a better version of herself, not as a version that had been altered by the frontier into something she wasn't. She had arrived on that platform with everything she needed already in her, and the ranch had given it somewhere to go. That was the thing she wanted to understand. Not that hardship had improved her, she resisted that framing, had resisted it since she first encountered it in the books she read as a girl. The idea that suffering was a refining process that made people worth more afterward. She had not needed to be improved. She had needed a situation that required what she had, and she had been lucky enough to find one, and unlucky in the specific way that had set her on the road to finding it. Both true, both real, neither canceling the other. September arrived, and Samuel Mercer made his opinions about it known in the way of all infants continuously and without schedule. Eliza had prepared for this as thoroughly as she prepared for anything, which turned out to be useful preparation and also completely inadequate, because there is no adequate preparation for the particular exhaustion of caring for a new person who exists tirelessly outside the category of things that can be organized and scheduled. She functioned. She did not function gracefully. She developed new appreciation for Clara Veitch, who came twice a week with food and a cheerful refusal to comment on the state of the kitchen, and for Caleb, who turned out to be the kind of father she had not known how to predict, not instinctively certain, not performing ease, but deeply willing and fully present in the way he was present with everything that mattered to him. She watched him with Samuel the way she had learned to watch him with things he cared about, the focused, quiet attention, the patience with difficulty, the absence of any need to be seen doing it correctly. He sat with Samuel in the sitting room on the nights the baby wouldn't settle, talking to him in the low, steady voice she had heard through the door. On that first evening, when she stood in the doorway sometimes and listened, and felt something she recognized now as what it actually was love, of the clear-eyed, undramatic, daily variety, which was the only kind she entirely trusted. Nathaniel came once more in October. He came without announcement, which she had come to expect from him, and he stood in the yard looking at the ranch with the expression she had seen in June, the absorbing of evidence. She came out to him, Samuel on her arm, and watched him look at the baby, with the complicated expression of someone encountering a consequence of their own choices made real. "He's healthy?" Nathaniel said. "Very," she said loud. Definite about things. Something moved across Nathaniel's face. Not quite a smile, the near approach of one. "Like his mother," he said, and it was the first thing he had ever said to her that was purely genuine without the armor of formality around it. "So, Caleb keeps telling me," she said. They stood in the October light, and it was not warm between them. She did not expect warmth and did not require it. What it was resolved. The weight of what had happened on the platform was not gone. She would not pretend it was gone, because that would be a lie. And she had built her life on the refusal of convenient lies. But it no longer had the character of an open wound. It had the character of an old scar still there, still real, part of the map of her, and no longer hurting. "The Henderson operation wrote back," she said. "They're implementing the supply system." "I heard," he said. "They told 3 other ranches." "I know, I'm writing to those 3. She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to continue doing this. There are a dozen operations in this county running on reactive purchasing and losing money they could keep. I can help with that." Nathaniel looked at her. "That's yes," he said. "You should. I wasn't asking for permission," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't offering it. I was agreeing." He paused, with the particular effort of someone who has been working on something. "For what it's worth." She accepted this with a nod. They talked briefly about the land agreement and the eastern boundary, and he left, and she stood in the yard with Samuel on her arm, and watched his horse go down the track and felt, without sentimentality, the particular satisfaction of a thing that was genuinely finished. Caleb appeared from the barn and came to stand beside her, looking down the track. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, "it's done now. Properly done." He looked at her profile and then at Samuel, who was looking at the middle distance, with the focused, slightly suspicious expression of a 2-month-old encountering October. "What was it like," he said, when he came. "Like closing a ledger," she said. "You checked the final figures, you confirmed the balance, you put it on the shelf." She looked at him. "It doesn't have to be dramatic to be real." He nodded. He understood. The evening came the way evenings came in fall fast, the light going from gold to dark in less time than felt fair. The temperature dropping 20 degrees in an hour, the ranch collecting itself into its nighttime shape. She fed Samuel in the kitchen while Caleb did the evening check on the herd with Pete, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling the horses in the barn, the particular creak of the addition in the wind that she had come to know as distinct from the creak of the original house. Scout on the porch doing his perimeter assessment, the distant sound of Hobbs' off-key humming from the bunkhouse. All of it hers, all of it known. She thought about what she would write to Margaret, her cousin in Philadelphia, who had been sending letters of increasing warmth since the wedding announcement, and had recently sent a blanket for Samuel that was extremely fine and somewhat impractical for ranch life, and that she planned to use anyway. She thought about what she would say about the year, about the platform, and the 6 months, and the blizzard, and the ring, and the baby, and Nathaniel, and the Henderson operation, and all the incremental daily work of building something real. She would not say it was easy. She would say it was possible. She would say that what was required of her was already in her, that the frontier had not created anything new so much as it had cleared away everything that was obscuring what was already there. She would say that the worst moment of the year, the platform, 4 seconds plain, had been the thing that sent her to a kitchen table in a ranch house, where the accounts were in a tin box and the stove required specific handling, and that from that kitchen table everything else had followed with the logic of things that were meant, not destined. She did not use that word. Meant, in the sense that the right conditions produced the right outcomes when the right people refused to walk away from themselves. She had refused to walk away from herself. On the platform, on the horse, on the snow-covered bank, in the kitchen with Nathaniel, at the window in December when she had understood, she had stopped counting the months. At every point where it would have been easier to become smaller, she had stayed the size she was. That was the work. Not one dramatic choice, but 100 small ones every day, in the direction of being honestly who you were, regardless of whether the current situation was asking for it. Samuel made a sound against her shoulder that was not quite a word, but had the unmistakable quality of a declaration. "I know," she said to him. "I know." Caleb came back in as the dark was fully settled, cold from the evening air, and he looked at her and the baby in the kitchen light, and he stopped, the way he stopped sometimes, just to look. She had learned to allow this, the being seen, the full and unreserved being seen, which was the thing she had least known how to do when she arrived on that platform, and which she thought was possibly the most important thing she had learned. "Done for the night," she said. "Done," he said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her once on the forehead, which he did sometimes without announcement or ceremony, and then he took Samuel very carefully into his arms, and Samuel regarded him with the focused suspicion of a person who is still making up his mind about most things. "He has your eyes," Caleb said. "He has dark eyes," she said. "Most babies do. He has the way you look at things," he said. "Like he's deciding whether to trust the situation." She looked at her son. She thought Caleb was probably right. The fire in the stove was doing what a good fire does. Scout pushed open the kitchen door and came in from the porch and settled under the table with his long exhale of completion. Outside, the October dark had the quality of a Colorado night, full and real and enormous. More sky than most people ever stand under. More stars than the eye can organize into any pattern that makes sense. She had thought, when she left Philadelphia, that she was going to somewhere. She understood now that she had been arriving somewhere. The difference was the direction of the looking outward toward an imagined future, or present in the actual life that had assembled itself while she was paying attention. She was paying attention. She intended to keep paying attention. The woman Nathaniel Crow had dismissed in 4 seconds had needed nothing from the world but a situation that required what she already had. The frontier had provided it. In the raw, difficult, honest way, the frontier provided most things without apology and without cushioning, and without any guarantee of outcome. She had done the rest herself. That was the truth of it, without embellishment, without the comfortable narrative of rescue or redemption. No one had saved her. The arrangement had given her ground to stand on, and she had stood on it, and she had built from there, and what she had built was hers in the fullest sense, not given to her, not restored to her, not revealed as something she had always secretly been, made by the daily, unglamorous, honest work of being exactly who she was in a place that needed exactly what she had to offer. She looked across the kitchen at her husband, who was talking quietly to their son, in the particular way. He talked to things he cared about, low, steady, without performance. She looked at the shelf where the account books sat in the order she had established. 9 months of a system that worked. She looked at the window where the Colorado dark pressed in from outside, enormous and indifferent and completely beautiful in the way of things that do not require your approval to be what they are. She was home. She had built the home. She had found the man, and the man had found her, and between them they had made something that neither of them could have made alone. And that was not a fairy tale, it was just true. And true things she had found were almost always more interesting than the fairy tale would have been. Samuel made another sound. She reached over and put her hand on his small, warm back, feeling the breath of him go in and out with the sturdy regularity of new life that has decided it intends to stay. Outside, the wind moved across the Colorado dark. The ranch held its shape against it, the way things that are well built hold their shape not by rigidity, but by knowing what they are. She knew what she was. It had taken 19 days on a coach, a 4-second dismissal, a blizzard, a snow-covered bank, a mountain ridge, a ring, and one August afternoon to make that knowledge complete. But it had always been true. It had only needed somewhere to be true in. She was Eliza Mercer. She had been Eliza Hart. She was and had always been enough.